To moderate our final panel, I would like to welcome to the stage HillVets Director of Programs, Jodi Harman.
Afternoon, everybody. How we doing? It is my honor to moderate the final panel of CAPCON 7. As the Director of Programs, the lead program falls under my purview, and I couldn't be prouder of this cohort, my first cohort. Future cohorts are going to have very large shoes to fill. Hello, ladies. These three experts are going to be discussing with us today a topic, national insecurity, explicating the experiences of female identifying military-affiliated community members. I'd like to welcome Dr. Leandra Hernandez, Dr. Amy May, and Victoria McDermott. Each of them is going to take a few minutes and introduce herself, and then we'll get started with some questions. Go ahead, ladies, whoever would like to go first.
Can you hear me okay?
We sure can, thank you.
Great. We want to take this opportunity to thank you all for having us to present here today. We're sad that we could not make it in person, but being military affiliated ourselves, we are geographically dispersed kind of all over the country. We want to thank the organizers for allowing this really fantastic hybrid version of the conference. I am Victoria McDermott. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Journalism at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. My research using qualitative methods explores how power is communicated in traditionally masculine environments, specifically the military and in STEM. I am a military spouse of an enlisted soldier. Together we've been at 3 duty stations, Fort Bragg, Fort Wainwright, Alaska, and currently Fort Myer. He is currently a sentinel at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. If anyone is in town and would like to make it out, it's a gorgeous place to go this weekend. And I will let my colleagues introduce themselves before we kind of explain a little bit more about our previous work and collaboration together.
Thank you so much, Tori. My name is Amy May, and greetings from Fairbanks, Alaska. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Journalism here at UAF. And very much like my colleagues, Tori and Leah, I really focus my research on gender and power and trying to understand how those play out in a variety of different contexts, including higher education and the military, which is what brings us together today. So I'm really interested in the experiences of women who serve, and I use women in as most inclusive way as possible. And I'm really interested in their experiences, not only within the context of their service, but within higher education as they continue to pursue their educational goals, and then also the experiences of dependence and that sort of thing. So outside of work, my family has a rich history in the military, which is why it is so humbling, and I just feel so privileged to be here today. My dad and my grandfather served in Vietnam and World War II, respectively, and in the Navy, and then much to their chagrin, I ended up married to an Army officer who is now a retired lieutenant colonel, and I spent 22 years in service to this country. And again, thank you so much for having us here today.
Awesome. Thank you all. My name is Dr. Leandra Hernandez. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at Utah Valley University and also the associate academic director for the Center for Social Impact. My pronouns are she, her, AF, and my research focuses on topics such as gender violence, reproductive justice, culture and identity, in various areas of the communication disciplines such as health communication, Latino communication studies, and media studies. Now, within a military communication studies framework, my research is focused on the experiences of military spouses in academia and culturally inclusive approaches to military-centric pedagogy. Outside of academia, similarly to my good friends here, I also have a rich history of military service in my family. So undoubtedly, we all made our way to military communication studies in one way or another. Both of my grandfathers served in the U.S. Army during World War II. Several uncles served and also fought in Vietnam. And my husband served in the U.S. Navy for 10 years and then departed as a lieutenant so I could pursue my dreams in academia when I finally landed a tenure track job. Now, I met Tori and Amy in 2017 when I was working on my first book entitled Military Spouses with Graduate Degrees, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Thriving Amidst Uncertainty. And it was such a wonderful experience that was co-edited with my good friend, Dr. Jennifer Belding, who is also a military spouse, researcher, and faculty member. It was a recipient of a 2019 Military Writers Society of America Bronze Medal, and while we are very thankful to have received that, I think what we're most proud of with that book is that every single chapter in that book was co-authored by a military spouse across various disciplines in academia, while we talked about our experiences in graduate school, certification programs, our experiences with mental health, and the like. So I'm thrilled to be here with Tori and Amy, two incredible colleagues, advocates, and friends.
From that fantastic collaboration working on the first book, or should I say Leah's first book, we then together came and edited and published a volume in 2020 entitled, and I don't know how we did it in the middle of the pandemic, we thank our contributors so much once again, entitled Supporting the Military Affiliated Learner, Communication Approaches to Military Pedagogy and Education. And in this book, we really sought to challenge the academic community to reevaluate how they're supporting our military-affiliated learners in higher education, as well as how to kind of address the military-civilian academic divide that can really cause disparities as well as barriers to military-affiliated academic achievement and retention. A really important thing that we also asked for our contributors was to come up with tangible recommendations and strategies for each of their chapters. And so part 2 of this book's objectives were to implement programs and develop strategies to really facilitate equitable academic integration from application to graduation. And we found that that was really powerful. And once again, thank all of our contributors.
That book experience, as Leah and Tori have already mentioned, brought together a group of incredible scholars and practitioners and agencies that work to support our vets and the most inclusive use of military-affiliated learner possible. And we wanted to do more. So we joined forces with a group of scholars who were working to establish the communication and military division at our national conference, our national level, where all of us communication scholars get together and hang out. And that group is known as the National Communication Association. So we are now in our second year of existence. 2021 was the launch of the Communication and Military Division, formerly also known as CMD. As I mentioned, this is our second year. We're all members of it, and then I serve as chair of that division this year. And the entire focus of the Communication and Military Division, or CMD, is to really help us learn all about communication, messages, discourses within the military, but also about the military as well. So this is an area where we actively research, actively publish, actively work with practitioners, collaborators, because there's so much to learn and discover and explore.
So before we kind of jump into the questions that we've posed for ourselves today, and hopefully for you all to engage in the Q&A at the end, we want to just jump into some background information related to how we situate ourselves and make sense of gender and how we approach our scholarship. So we approach our scholarship in a way that seeks to really understand how communication and language shape our world and our understanding. We also acknowledge that power and/or limited access to power can create big barriers to achievement, especially in the case of gender or gender inequity. So we want to acknowledge that sex and gender are different. Sex refers to biological characteristics of being male, female, or intersex. And gender, on the other hand, is a kind of socially constructed through communication and discourse construct that's performed on a non-binary spectrum. And while this definition is based in our communication literature, we do think it's important to note that in 2021, the Pentagon press secretary also kind of affirmed these conceptions of gender, stating there's no place for violence and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, or sexual or sex characteristics in the Department of Defense. So while we do acknowledge the fantastic strides the military has been making to make it a more inclusive place for women and gender diverse people, the crux of our presentation today is to really consider that potentially being included doesn't mean that we've created a space for belonging. And we're kind of considering and grappling with this idea that increased representation does not always equal equitable experiences. So as our presentation title alludes to, what is national security without women? National insecurity. In that, today we seek to consider how we might be able to change some of the challenges that women may face in the military while in service or outside of service by considering three overarching questions from a communications scholar perspective. First, we consider what are the current barriers affecting women affiliated with military service. Second, we're going to talk about the challenges that intersect with current threats to national security. And finally, we're going to consider how social media might be used by women affiliated with military service to promote, change, and share their stories. So before we jump into these questions more specifically, Amy is just going to give us some important background information about current data on women working to support military operations. These include active duty members, reservists, military contractors, and then Leah will provide some additional insights into the related experiences of spouses.
Thank you so much, Tori, for setting the stage and providing that needed context and background. I've got just one more thing to add as we get started. Please engage in self-care as we go into this discussion. We're going to be tackling and discussing reproductive rights, sexual violence, gender discrimination. So some of these topics can be really heavy. So do what you need to do to make sure that you feel that this is a presentation that can support you and build you up. All right, so I'm going to start with some data. Out of all of us, the fact that I'm presenting the data is funny because I'm the one who's not always into the numbers. But let me start out by hitting you with a bunch of statistics, and then we'll try to figure out what it all means. All right, so according to the Department of Defense and data that was published in 2021, and this is in their really beautiful infographic, the portrait of active duty and DoD government civilian women. They give us a lot of information to understand the current state of affairs, if you will. So if we look across branches of service, about 1 of every 6 soldiers is a woman. And again, I'm using that term in the most inclusive way possible. So about 16% of all of our soldiers are women. If we look at different branches that make up the armed forces, we see significant disparities in where women are most likely to serve by branch. If we consider percentages, women are most likely to join the Air Force. About 19% of women serve as airmen, and airmen is the term that is used. So I am using it with the intent of being inclusive there. Now, if we look, if women are most likely to serve in the Air Force, you're probably thinking, well, where are they the least represented? And I'll let you form your guess real quick before I do the big reveal. It is the Marines. About 8% of women serve in the Marines, making it the least balanced in terms of gender equity by the numbers. And if we consider rank, about 14% of senior enlisted personnel are women, and about 15.7% of our officers are women. Now, if we consider the military occupational specialty, or MOS, we see some interesting trends there as well. Women are more likely to serve in administrative positions on the enlisted side, and they are most likely to serve in healthcare related roles on the officer side. Now, if you consider race and ethnicity, women are actually more diverse than their male counterparts. About 71.4% of active duty men are white, and that's compared to about 56.7% of women, with a significant percentage belonging to our women of color, specifically Black and African American soldiers. Now, another interesting difference that we see when we look at gender data is that women who serve in the military are less likely than their male counterparts to be married. About 46% of our active duty women are married, and that's compared to about 58% of men. And interestingly, women are much more likely, at about 50%, to be in relationships where both partners are serving in the military. So only about 7% of men are in those dual service roles. And women are less likely to have seen combat than their male counterparts. This is in part driven by just women not being able to access those combat roles historically until recently in our history. About 15% of our women have seen combat, and that's compared to about 35% of men. And we know that retaining women is a priority across the armed forces, but in a really groundbreaking study by the Army in their first annual release of their data for 2021, the Army Career Engagement Survey, we see that in the top 5 reasons for women making that decision to leave active duty service relates to that decision to parent, whether or not they're going to choose to have children, and that's going to be something that we'll explore throughout this presentation as well. So to some, women are underrepresented in all branches of the military compared to the general population. Compared to military leadership, women are less likely to serve in those leadership roles, and they tend to occupy MOSs that are traditionally associated with the feminine or women's type work, and I use that with air quotes very loosely. So now that we've considered the experiences and have a better understanding of women and kind of what it looks like, a snapshot of their service, let's consider civilians briefly. So much more equitable in terms of the percentages of women and men serving. About 48 of every 100 DoD civilian employees are women. As with our active duty service members, they are likely to work in administration and healthcare fields. About 27.4% of DoD employees are female veterans, and they are underrepresented, as we saw with our military counterparts, to occupy those senior executive service positions, those SES type roles. So now that we've considered what it's like for those active duty service women and also briefly looking at that civilian data population, let's talk a little bit about the experiences of the military spouses, and I turn it over to my colleague, Leah.
So according to a 2020 report published by Military OneSource, there are over 1.5 million active duty family members. 38.1% of active duty family members are spouses, 61.4% are children, and about 0.5% are adult dependents. Now, almost 50% of all active duty family members are married, and there are almost 600,000 active duty spouses across all branches. Now, when we're thinking about gender, as you could probably guess, 90.7% of spouses are women, 9.3% of spouses are men, although the data doesn't really tell us much about transgender identities, non-binary spouses, and the like. So that's another area for future inquiry. Now, when we're thinking about the role of women in the military, as we all know, women have played a significant role in the military since its inception and now are serving in all kinds of positions and combat occupations. However, they still experience barriers while attempting to support military operations for a variety of reasons. And we're going to be talking about 3 in particular today: mothering or the parenthood postpartum experience, women as invisible veterans, and gender and sexual violence. And I'll be touching a little bit on mothering and parenthood, given my own interest in reproductive justice. So motherhood and military service have oftentimes been framed as antithetical to each other. And this theme is present in military history, mediated representations of motherhood in the military, and also in academic research that explores how women service members navigate parenting, maternity leave, deployment, and familial/societal reintegration. Additionally, the hyper-focus on reproduction in military contexts oftentimes focuses on women service members' reproductive health and decision-making, not on men's, which is a detriment to all parents in the military when we think about shortened maternity, paternity leaves, and other topics like that. Most predominantly, according to Megan McFarlane, a military communication studies researcher, a popular argument pertaining to our time today is that pregnant service women are a liability to national security because they inhibit troop readiness, or more specifically, their reproductive capabilities inhibit troop readiness. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about media coverage of military mothers and then transition to research on military motherhood. Now, military mothers have been making waves in the last several years. Some of you might remember photos of active duty service mothers breastfeeding in their uniforms. Other mothers have come to the media as well in the case of Kimberly Rivera, a U.S. soldier and mother of 5, who publicly, vehemently was opposed to war. And media coverage of her case and several others have illustrated how her military role was seen to be associated with what has become the crisis of motherhood. And I put that in air quotes because that's oftentimes the phrase that is used in many news articles and scholarly articles. The idea here is that motherhood is antithetical to violence, war, and effective soldiering. In other words, you can be an effective mom or you can be an effective soldier, but you can't be both. Megan McFarlane, again, has illustrated how this has resulted in the military mommy problem, or a pregnancy problem, that finds pejorative message frames about pregnancy and then responses across the spectrum that try to mitigate those message frames, especially if we're thinking about the role of communication and the mass media in this larger context. So when we think about how military motherhood is represented in the media, then we can start thinking about the connections between that and actual experiences of service members while trying to parent and be good at their careers as well. Now, some of you may have heard recently that the maximum amount of leave for secondary caregivers in the military increased from 14 days to 21 days earlier this year in February, according to administrative messages that were released by both the Navy and the Marine Corps. Now, soldiers, from a physical parenting perspective, are also now excused from wearing service uniforms during their pregnancy and up to 1 year postpartum. Now, before now, as you could probably guess, or as you might know, soldiers had to buy new uniforms or get their uniforms altered. And with this new policy, soldiers can wear a combination of Army uniforms and maternity uniforms. So there is now finally an acknowledgement of some of the ways in which parenthood and pregnancy shapes service members' bodies. Moreover, as the military is moving to be more inclusive, the U.S. Army announced an exception to policies earlier this year in March that extends the postpartum body time frame from 180 days to 365 days for postpartum soldiers to meet body fat standards in accordance with Army Regulation 600-9. So, in line with these different discourses that talk about the challenges associated with military motherhood and military parenting, we're also starting to see new initiatives take way that are trying to combat pregnancy bias and parenting discrimination across the board. Now, another area of inquiry explores how military moms experience challenges during times of deployment and reintegration. Now, according to Walsh and Neves, while many military mothers demonstrate remarkable resilience and coping abilities, all mothers returning home from deployment will confront some sort of challenge associated with reestablishing relationships, roles, routines, and oftentimes these challenges, research suggests, are compounded by PTSD symptoms and other psychological impacts. Now, the reintegration challenges can include reconnecting with children, negotiating parental control and household responsibilities, reassuming formal roles within the family, adjustments to new family dynamics, and more. And as you could probably guess, not only is it difficult for all family members to maintain communication while on deployments and missions and the like, but it is also really challenging for mothers specifically in a reintegration context, because when fathers become primary caregivers during deployment, or maybe another family member, it can be challenging for mothers to identify where they fit into the family dynamic that has developed during their absence. Additionally, there are also a lack of programs that exist for military mothers, specifically in reintegration contexts. Now, research by Schad, Montgomery, and Gaddes in 2019 highlights that there were very little, perhaps none at all, programs intended to solely support deploying and reintegrating military mothers. And one study of military mothers regarding their deployment and reintegration experiences noted a lack of resources to address their unique gendered circumstances and needs. Research does suggest that FRGs, or family readiness groups, can serve as a possible source of support and connections, but ultimately research highlights that we need to have more programs that focus on reintegration for mothers specifically. Now, what we've been seeing recently leaves us with no shortage of topics that we could talk about in this panel. The very last one I'll chat about is something that has been on our minds over the last month, and that is the impact of Roe v. Wade on reproductive bodies in the military. Now, several articles are starting to surface that talk about how military women are going to suffer even more with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Now, military and VA medical centers could not perform abortions due to the Hyde Amendment, but official policy does allow women service members to get advice from commanding officers, healthcare providers, and resources. And this is what is particularly concerning now, as we're starting to see different state regulations come up and different state regulations really currently be under battle. Now, current military regulations spell out procedures for service women intending to get an abortion. Under some rules, women service members must notify their commanding officers that they plan to get an abortion. But pre the overturning of Roe v. Wade, many women did not need to follow this regulation because they could easily access an abortion procedure where they were living. However, now, if women's service members have to travel out of state to get an abortion, it could likely take much longer. And in that case, they would have to notify commanding officers, which also raises new questions about privacy and safety. Now, other research by Van Landingham and Kubek highlights associated issues with service members, and now we are starting to see women service members take to social media and the news to share their abortion experiences associated with rape, violence, and the like. Now, according to the Department of Defense, 13,000 women and 7,500 men, service members, were sexually assaulted or raped in 2018. And their research also found that 76% of victims did not report what happened to them. So the numbers are seemingly increasing according to DoD research. And when we take it all together, we're starting to see how this one law is starting to have ripple effects with unintended consequences that we just quite simply haven't quite seen yet. So next, Tori is going to tell us a little bit about women as invisible veterans, and then Amy will bring it all together to talk a little bit more about assault and gender violence.
Thank you so much for that overview, Leah. So motherhood obviously poses such important challenges for us to consider. However, women also face challenges as invisible veterans when they leave service. So you might have heard the term before, invisible veteran, but it really kind of alludes to the fact that military women are expected to fit a kind of masculine ideal of what a military member is, and they're rarely recognized as veterans after service. Even though female veterans are the fastest growing population of the veteran population, they only made up 4% of the veteran population in the year 2000. However, they're projected to make up 18% of the veteran population by 2040. Currently, there's an estimated 2 million female veterans out of the 17.4 million veteran total in the US. So Eckler in 2022 really argued that female veterans experience both invisibility and hypervisibility across civilian and military lives. The current structure of the military makes it so that their needs are both invisible as well as hypervisible, thinking about postpartum, to their fellow soldiers. And when transitioning to civilian life, women often report having their service dismissed or ignored because they do not fit the ideal or stereotype of a veteran. One of the chapters in our book, our fantastic contributor Nancy talked about how her service was often dismissed. When she went back to work in the civilian workforce, people would often say, oh, you probably just did secretary work. That probably didn't really contribute much to the overall mission of the military. This is really disheartening because research shows that women are really prideful of their accomplishments during military service and that they actually really want to be effective service members and serve their country. But this kind of invisibility of female service members, both in and out of service, can pose considerable barriers to success with these current institutional norms and structures. So Leah kind of touched on some of the issues regarding readjusting to family life when returning home from deployment and training. Sustaining breastfeeding following active duty can also be difficult, and exposures and injuries sustained during military service have also been found to impact postpartum behaviors. Moreover, Bradwish and Brown in 2022 argued that female veterans encounter multiple health challenges when transitioning from military to civilian life. Female veterans experience similar combat trauma to their male counterparts, as Amy mentioned. However, they also experience increased potential for sexual trauma or sexual violence during service. And this has resulted in higher rates of post-traumatic stress post-service. Additionally, female veterans report experiencing difficulty when leaving service. In a study run by the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, 282 female veterans were surveyed, and 62% felt that their overall transition from active duty to veteran status was difficult. Of that, only 23% felt that they received the support and training for transitioning to the civilian workforce that they needed when leaving the military. On top of that, some of the challenges associated with the transition outside of the military were loss of identity and purpose, difficult with reintegration, health concerns, both mental and physical, and finding and keeping employment. The women also reported about 31% considered themselves to be underemployed, characterized as not having enough paid work or not doing work that makes use of all their skills and ability. And 54% reported having difficulty navigating resources in their local community. So even though we have programs like the Transition Assistance Program, TAP, which have sought to alleviate some of these challenges when facing leaving service, financial literacy, career readiness, veterans have often reported that these resources might not be 100% useful and that they're often considered boxes to be checked by leadership. So when they're not framed as valuable by leadership to attend and engage in, this can impact, their overall value within the lives of the veterans. Additionally, these resources, similar to some of the other programs mentioned earlier, might be kind of really built around this masculine identity or masculine career path. For example, the resources associated with TAP might assume that service members transitioning out have family support and access to stable childcare when searching for new careers. However, this might not actually be the situation for many female veterans. Research has found that specific factors, such as being disabled, single, and having dependent children, are salient risk factors for homelessness among female veterans. And research shows that 1 in 3 homeless female veterans have dependent children. Furthermore, female veterans face a 4 times higher risk of homelessness than their non-veteran female counterparts. So that all is kind of contributing to these barriers that continue to compound on different ways that make it difficult to be a woman veteran. And then finally, I know Amy's going to talk a little bit about the gender violence, but a meta-review of literature found that mental health problems are a prevalent issue among female veterans as well, and professional medical care may be limited for helping these veterans. Female veterans are less likely to be satisfied with Veterans Affairs healthcare access and services. And unfortunately, there have been reports of sexual violence occurring in Veterans Affairs centers. So even outside of military service, some things can still transfer. In the survey of 5,000 plus active duty and service members and veterans, 85% said it was extremely or very important to address issues facing women veterans, making it more important to consider women's experiences in the military for creating change.
Thank you, Tori. Thank you, Leah. Now that we have a better understanding of some of the challenges associated with reproductive rights, and also the experience of women as invisible vets, let's get deeper and talk a little bit about gendered and sexual violence. Again, self-care as we get deeper into this issue. So we have the published data, and the published data has been challenged as limiting. So let's go through it and see if we can sense make it. So Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin described the collective issue of sexual violence in the military as a persistent and corrosive problem. So studies from DOD and also RAND estimate about 6.2% of service women and about 0.7% of service men have experienced sexual assault or harassment in the past 12 months. However, these data are limited because they're really only capturing that formal reporting process. And so the data are somewhat limited and do not give us an accurate representation of what may be going on. So if we look to the popular press and try to better understand what is happening, there was a pretty significant article that came out in 2021 published by the New York Times. And in their research and in their investigation, they found that 1 in 4, or roughly 25% of military service women had experienced some form of sexual violence, whether reported or not. So it's been called an epidemic. It's called a poison in this New York Times article, in part because of the physical and emotional trauma. And Tori mentioned the issues with mental health. It's a recruitment and retention concern for the military as well. RAND, again, in a 2014 report, reported that 8,000 service members left the military in the 28-month period after they were sexually harassed. And that's over and above normal attrition. And around 2,000 or so left directly after their sexual assault. And if you are a woman navigating sexual harassment or gendered violence within the context of the military, there are other significant factors that impact how you're able to navigate in the aftermath. Many of these service women, they work with their aggressors. They may be targeted by a superior officer, and they often live within the confines of a military base, which isolates them from the larger community and potentially the larger access to resources, and also from their family when they're stationed at remote military locations. So we know that there's a problem, but what are some of the factors that are contributing to this ongoing plague, epidemic, poison, however we want to frame it? We know that the military has training programs in place. We know that there are reporting structures. We know that there are resources. So why are women in the military still being targeted in 2022? So perhaps we can learn the most from the recent case involving Vanessa Guillen to help us understand some of the larger issues that may be at play here. So if you're not familiar with the Vanessa Guillen case, in April of 2020, Private First Class Vanessa Guillen went missing from Fort Hood in Texas. Despite Guillen reporting previous incidents with sexual harassment, the Army was slow to respond, taking what has been called by her family little to no action to find the missing soldier. So as we're going to talk about later, social media really became a force to help draw attention to Vanessa's case. And once it caught the attention of activists, former President Trump, and celebrities, the search intensified in response to what was a public outcry to find justice for Vanessa. But it was too late. After 3 months after her initial disappearance, 20 miles outside of Fort Hood, she was found with sexual trauma and also burn marks. So later investigations by military officials found that Guillen was murdered after she told her harasser and fellow service member, Specialist Robinson, that she was going to report him for sexual harassment using the formal chain of command. So Guillen's story is a haunting reminder of the dangers that women face when reporting sexual assault and harassment in the military and the urgent need for further reform. So how do we address these larger issues of gender violence and sexual assault, sexual violence, and sexual harassment? So more questions than we have answers. One of the biggest questions that are debated in the communication and the feminist gender literature is the culture of the military creating this toxic environment? You may have heard the term toxic masculinity, and is this something that the military is dealing with? So this debate is long and it's complicated. As Leah mentioned, women have a rich history in the military, but they are now doing and serving in roles that were previously off limit to them. So we know in 1948, when they passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, that women were finally allowed to join all branches of the service. But it wasn't until recently in 2016 when then Defense Secretary Ash Carter really opened up all MOSs to women. And we see this as a positive step toward equality, but some people express fear, concern, and contempt. And we know these issues are coming out and being debated, as Leah mentioned, when it comes to reproductive rights and so many other issues. So critics have argued that lower standards are going to be implemented for women. That's going to create this unfair system that reduces military capabilities and the readiness for combat. Others frame women as distractions. A quote from Parker, 2015, "Men tend to like women quite a lot and either will be tempted to express their attraction or will want to protect their female companions at the cost of the mission." So once again, the Vanessa Guillen case provides us with a starting point for further understanding these issues. U.S. Secretary of the Army, Ryan McCarthy, ordered an independent review of the handling of the Vanessa Guillen case, and the findings of the committee documented and described what they labeled in their report a toxic culture that set in over time out of neglect, direct quote from the Fort Hood Independent Review Committee from 2020. Moreover, the culture was perpetuated over a series of commands. So while that Fort Hood Independent Review provided important insights into the toxic cultural norms at Fort Hood, the issues that were uncovered by the review committee, including underreporting and long delays in the investigation and prosecution of these sexual assault cases, are not isolated to Fort Hood. They exist in other installations across the armed forces. So more research is needed to really understand women's experiences while serving, including the institutional and the cultural norms that may perpetuate violence and sexual harassment. May and McDermott, in a research study currently in press, argue cultural norms and values such as loyalty, service to the mission, and fellow soldiers may complicate reporting for some female service members. However, there's hope. Recent legislation has addressed previous barriers and will hopefully usher in further reform. Congress passed the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act of 2020. This legislation ushered in historic changes to the military justice system. Under this legislation, sexual harassment is now punishable under the Military Code of Justice. Moreover, sexual harassment investigations have been removed from the chain of command, and now they will be reviewed by an independent investigation. This is incredibly important, as some commanders have avoided pursuing formal investigations of sexual harassment or assault to maintain the reputation of their respective units. Again, that is coming directly from the report of the Fort Hood Independent Review Committee. So now that we've established that there are significant barriers that women face, including reproductive justice issues, the experience of female and women vets, and gender and sexual violence, Tori is going to start a discussion related to how gendered experiences in the military intersect with national security.
So this is a really important layer to add to this conversation about how women's experiences could intersect with current or new threats to national security. And we're specifically talking about the rise in extremism. We want to note that this is an area of research that we actually just started kind of getting into, and so we're still learning, but it's been really fascinating, and we think it's a really important topic to always touch on. So we're really seeing a rise in extremist ideology that can negatively impact women service members and dependents in a variety of different ways. Extremist groups like QAnon, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers really seem to target military-affiliated people for their military training. And terrorism scholars and social psychologists have argued that things like QAnon appeal to some service members because some of their narratives seem to have some of the same moral foundations that might draw someone to serve in the military. For example, care for others, sanctity of ideals, respect for authority, fairness, liberty, and loyalty. These can all be seen both in the military culture and, unfortunately, within some of these extremist groups. And the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point unfortunately concluded that there's significant overlap between QAnon and white supremacy. And a lot of these groups their ideologies are really based in sexism and racism. A 2019 Military Times survey found that 36% of active duty troops had seen evidence of white supremacist and racist ideologies in their ranks. And more recently, in 2021, a survey of 5,000 active duty and veteran members found that 1 in 3 participants surveyed had personally witnessed extremism among the ranks of military and post 9/11 veterans. So additionally, service members who kind of pursue racist content may be more likely to stumble upon some of these extremist conspiracy ideologies, as there is that kind of overlap. This can be really problematic for women and isolating and in extreme cases deadly, because the idea of white supremacy is profoundly based in sexism, and the misogyny is really baked into the kind of movement. So women are expected to carry out the most traditional gender roles: cooking, cleaning, making babies, and we have seen through, unfortunately, like the insurrection, that people, especially white supremacists, might be violent and perpetuate sexual violence against women and people of color to try to realign them to some of these traditional gender role stereotypes. This can also be seen while women are also targets of the hate. These groups may also be seeking to kind of gain women to join their ranks. For example, QAnon reportedly radicalized millions of women to believe in a network of conspiracy theories, and we know at least 2 military veterans were in attendance at the insurrection, 2 female military veterans, Ashley Babbitt, who served in the Air Force, and Jessica Watkins, an Army veteran. They both attended and participated in the insurrection. So while these threats to national security might focus on service members themselves, we also think that dependents could be considered or should be considered when we think about extremism. For example, women made up about 14% of those who were charged in the January 6th insurrection, and the defense sentencing, most of the defense, in a review of the defense's, motherhood was a key identity marker used to try to lessen some of the sentencing for the women. And one woman, Dawn Bancroft even tried to use her son's military service, noting that her son was in the military, as a way to get a kind of lesser sentence. Additionally, as women are often in charge of child rearing, these ideals could be perpetuated to children. And we can also maybe see this through military spouse social media pages. Even though these pages can provide important aspects of emotional support, they can also be used for kind of bullying and inform how those inside and outside of the military community make sense of the military spouse identity. You may have heard of the term dependopotamus, those who get married for the TRICARE benefits. That's a common stereotype of the military spouse identity. I'm currently working with an undergraduate student to uncover how do military support pages kind of shape the narrative of the military spouse identity. And we're really seeing a lot of the same ideals put forth surrounding military service, touted for military spouses as well. So care for others, sanctity of ideals, respect for authority, liberty, loyalty, as sort of ways for spouses to really rationalize all of the kind of impacts the military might have on their lives. So some other aspects that potentially could attract spouses to some of these far-right extremist movements include the military life. It can be a little bit isolating with frequent moves. Military spouses have reportedly been underemployed, and they often times have limited educational opportunities or limited opportunities to use the education that they do have because of certificate boundaries or just not jobs in the area that they have to move to. So what can we do? Unfortunately, we don't have all the answers at this time, but in 2020, the Army published a comprehensive review of Army command policy, and this was the first of its kind to address the use of social media and support social media to support extremist activities, and provided guidance to commanders for addressing prohibited activity that crosses the line into misconduct. So we think that's a fantastic step in the right direction. We also think that digital literacy training, especially for military service members and perhaps even their dependents, could serve as a way to help kind of combat this misinformation, disinformation, infodemic that we're seeing. But research is still being conducted, and we're still trying to figure out how this could affect women in a variety of different ways. So I'll throw it to Amy to close us out with an overview of social media.
Thank you so much, Tori. So Tori hit on media literacy and social media in our final few minutes together. Let's talk about the potential of social media to help us better understand the experiences of women, but also to usher in change. So social media, it creates both opportunities and challenges for military service members, their families, and the civilian community, which is becoming less connected to the military over time, less likely to have served or have family members who have served in the military. So some people know the military based on what they see in mass media, including social media, versus that firsthand experience that was more common in older generations. So there's a whole bunch of literature that argues social media is going to save us and be the end of us all. So when it comes to the military and social media use, we know that it is governed by OPSEC, operational security, and also branch-specific policies, as Tori and Lee have mentioned, Army Command Policy AR 600-20, for example. And I bet for my vets and service members who are in the audience, that if I were to quiz you on some of the rules of OPSEC and social media, you could probably list them off for me. But there's a whole lot of do nots. Do not post, your spouse's specific job on social media. Do not post where your spouse is ported. Do not. So there's lots of things that military service members and that larger dependent community needs to keep in mind as they're navigating social media. So, per the Army, it is important that all soldiers know when they are logged on to social media, they represent the U.S. Army. Soldiers using social media must abide by the Uniform Code of Military Justice, even when they're off duty. Commenting, posting, and liking to material that violates UCMJ or basic rules of soldiers' conduct are prohibited, along with talking negatively about supervisors or releasing sensitive information. So all that being said, women, service members and veterans and spouses and civilian DoD employees are turning to social media to share their stories. And I've identified 4 quick ways that they are using social media to sort of bring about and usher in change. So 1, challenging stereotypes. And this speaks to Leah's previous discussion. Tucker Carlson from Fox News angered the military, and social media came after him hard. So in March 2021, Tucker Carlson suggested that the military under Biden had gone too far to meet the needs of women who are now serving in uniform, including updating hairstyles and even modifying flight suits for those who are pregnant. Quote from Tucker, "So we've got new hairstyles and maternity flight suits. Pregnant women are going to fight our wars. It's a mockery of the U.S. Army." So women turn to social media, men turn to social media, vets turn to social media, active duty service members turn to social media, and really shared the important work that women do as soldiers day in, day out, every single day, to include supporting us on mission critical combat. So very important, using the social media to challenge those stereotypes that are presented. Second, activism. Again, I turn to I Am Vanessa Guillen as an example. Women, female soldiers and vets came out in force using the hashtag I Am Vanessa Guillen. The law was named after this movement to share their own experiences with sexual harassment, sexual and gendered violence as well. And just to point out, Vanessa Guillen's family, because they had no military credentials, couldn't even get on base to speak to a military official, couldn't even get to the MPs. They had to go outside of Fort Hood, outside of those security gates, and they organized via social media so that their voices could be heard. And as first-gen, not native speakers of English, they were able to rally everyone in their communities to come out and show force as well. Vets Rise for Roe is another movement we're seeing where military soldiers and service members and vets are sharing their abortion stories and advocating for legislative protections for women who serve in the military. State of Women Veterans was a social media campaign back in 2016, which really was the formal voice of the VA kind of sharing women's stories. So not only are individual soldiers turning grassroots style to social media, the military themselves are using social media to tell women's stories as recruitment strategies and to educate the general public. In addition, we're seeing social media being used for legislative reform. The Parenthood, Pregnancy, and Postpartum Directive is something that has been very active on social media, basically leading the change for policy reform, especially in the Army, which seems to be the most documented in the literature and popular press. And then finally, even though we don't fully understand it, we know that female and women soldiers and vets are turning to social media for social support, to find networks of others where they can share their experiences and understand and sense make their experience as United States soldiers. And so lots happening on the social media front, and we have lots to learn from these tools. And we have covered a lot as we've explored these big 3 questions with you this afternoon or morning for me. So what are the current barriers impacting women affiliated with military service? How do these challenges intersect with the current threats to national security? And finally, how is social media being used by women affiliated with the military to promote change, share their stories, and to come together? I know we're right at time, but we look forward to continuing this discussion if there's time for Q&A, but also to learn from your experiences as well. On behalf of Tori and Leah, thank you so much for giving us your time and your attention to discuss these issues.